12 times more. And in terms of human resources, 1.4 million, that is only active duty personnel.
Does that include the domestic stations overseas?
Yes, this is US military, yeah. So does not include reservists or civil service personnel in the Pentagon, just active duty military. So, you know, there can be a debate, there is a debate about what this means, and does the military have a role in this good governance thing, or in nation building as we used to call it? As you know, well, you may know Bob Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense, he said he would give part of his budget to the State Department. Mike Mullen, who was then the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, said the same thing. And 53 years, as I said, it's a record. But, you know, 12 times less, should this be a different scenario? I'm just showing the numbers and I'm trying to make sense of them. And a couple of things I want to leave you with before we go to questions. These are two trends that I noticed in the Foreign Service. And this humanizing thing goes also to one of my techniques for making the book interesting. And so the first technique was to show explicitly the link between what the Foreign Service does and the national interest, which I hope I did. And the second technique was to humanize it, as I said, and tell the stories and put human faces to these stories. And for everything that's in the book, I wanted to have at least one real-life example. And there is, since this is the American Chamber, things that are just amazing stories that obviously they're good and bad, the successes and failures in diplomacy. But one story that I'll never forget is how the American Embassy in Nigeria helped rice farmers increase their profits by 400%. So there were 5 million tons of rice consumed in Nigeria a year, at least at the time before they started doing this, and most of it was imports. It turned out that Nigerian farmers didn't know how to produce quality rice. And so the American Embassy started this program called Markets, and they had this idea of going to the buyers of rice to tell the rice farmers what they expected and what kind of rice they would buy. So that link was there, and when the farmers began producing the rice, then the embassy went to the banks to have them extend credit lines. And many other things that they did, but that was the result. Before the project, the average rice farmer in Nigeria was living on less than $2 a day. And at the end of the project, literally profits, was either profits or revenue, I forget which it was, but the point is, jumped 400%. And well, let me finish, because yeah, believe me, I'll get off track, and then you don't want to. But the humanizing trend that I noticed has these three aspects of it, and the first is the Foreign Service itself. It used to be 20, 30 years ago, the Foreign Service was very elitist, as you probably know. Most people who joined had some background or experience in international relations. Today, most of them don't. We have all kinds of professions, and the Foreign Service is so diverse today. No other foreign service in the world can match up. But there are people from almost every profession. Ethnically, they do want to diversify. They want the Foreign Service to look more and more like America. We're not there yet. 80% is still white. But 40% is women, which is a big change. 5% black, 7% Asian. The second aspect has to do with other countries. American diplomacy now wants to open up, to become more inclusive of people in other countries, not governments. So they want now to go beyond government-to-government diplomacy and do what Hillary Clinton calls people-to-people diplomacy. And the logic behind this is that even in countries that are not democracies, public opinion matters. You've got social media. So the American diplomats want to sometimes reach private citizens of those countries over the heads of the government. Because if you are to influence the country's behavior, the argument now goes, it's not enough just to lobby the government. You have to lobby directly the people of that country. And the third aspect is opening up or becoming more inclusive to the American public. Providing opportunities for private Americans to contribute to American diplomacy. That's still very vague. I'm not clear on how exactly that will happen. There is an office at the State Department that's supposed to be thinking about this, but I don't think they've specifically given options for Americans, to do that. And of course, another thing that the State Department and the Foreign Service are not good at is explaining what they do, right? And when they go to Capitol Hill to ask for money, the question is, you need this much money, what exactly is the money going to be spent on? And they have lost money because they're not able to explain to Congress specifically what these programs will achieve. And the second trend and the last slide here is what I call the Foreign Service's identity crisis. And this has to do with this list of duties that I had at the beginning, this very partial list of duties. Because before 9/11, most people in the Foreign Service came in with their own perception of what diplomacy was, and it was pretty much what you said at the beginning diplomacy was, and also an expectation of what they'll be doing. After 9/11, they were being asked to do more and more and more, all these things that we saw, these new duties with the governance thing and the PRTs in Iraq and going and wearing boots in the mud and being shot at every day in a war zone. They didn't expect to do that. And so that challenged their identity. And as one person in the book says, it was a shock to the system because we just didn't expect that. What's more important is that they weren't trained to do it. They're still not being trained to do it. The big thing in the Foreign Service is improvisation. You need to figure it out. You are literally thrown in a pool and you have to learn how to swim. And if you bring in people from such diverse backgrounds and make them diplomats, logically you would think that they get trained to be diplomats. Well, they don't. They don't. Many countries, including Singapore, have a much longer training course before you go to an embassy than the American Foreign Service. There's no orientation class when you come in. 5 weeks. That's it. And it's mostly bureaucracy. How do you fill a certain form, to move your stuff around, how to move your family, how to get paid, how to get leave of absence. But it's not about how to be a diplomat. There's still no teaching in the Foreign Service Institute. There are many great classes, but what they're not teaching is how to be a diplomat. And so then, what does that mean? You depend on your boss and your colleagues, right? That's the system that will then teach you. And if you're lucky to have a good boss in your first or second tour as a Foreign Service officer, great. But there are good bosses, but there are also bad bosses in the Foreign Service. So if you happen on a bad boss, then your career may be over before you know it. And so that's why training is so important. That's why Colin Powell wanted to institutionalize what he called professional development for diplomats. That still hasn't happened. Just the whole question of, and the questions that I asked at the beginning of, what is a diplomat? What do they do? What kind of skills do you need? How do you then recruit them? How do you train them? That is still sort of ad hoc. Another thing that the State Department, as I'm sure you know, is not good at is strategic thinking, right? And as Yuri Kim, who you saw at the beginning, as she said, strategic thinking is actually beaten out of you in the Foreign Service. Because now the focus is on being operational. You need to be there and get your hands dirty and basically get things done. Not sitting thinking the big thoughts. One of the things that American Foreign Service, if you get to the senior Foreign Service, you get in positions where you advise the Secretary of State, you advise the President. But most people in the Foreign Service never get to those positions. But that's a good question. Being able to provide good policy advice, should that be taught in the Foreign Service to everybody who comes in? Because it's not, right now it's not. And if there is a strategic thinker that is advising the secretary or the president, it's not because the institution made them such. It's because they had it in their DNA or they worked on self-improvement. And that's the thing. Even if you go to Iraq or Afghanistan, you don't get any training. You get, well, they teach you how to shoot for a day and a half in West Virginia. But you don't even carry a weapon. So, no language, because most people in Iraq don't speak Arabic, just because there's so many people needed. I mean, there are 1,600 Americans at the embassy in Baghdad. And turnover is every year. These tours are 1 year. So there's no way you can get enough Arabic speakers, however quickly you train them to go and serve in Baghdad. And I'll leave you with this, just of, the question of what kind of foreign service do we want? Do we want to keep these people basically, right now an American diplomat has to be a jack of all trades. The alternative is what? Having experts or specialists, but the downside of that is that you don't quite know what kind of expertise you might need, as I mentioned at the beginning, where and for how long. If you have a person who is, well, there is a position in Washington, a special envoy or something, for African diamonds. Yeah, that's a job, that's a real job. Well, if you have an expert in that position, well, what if in 5 years you don't need that expertise? So do you fire them? And so right now they have people rotating in this. It's a 2-year job in Washington, so most of the people who get it don't have any background, and so they have to learn from scratch. But that's what you do in the Foreign Service. You have to be quick study, you have to learn this literally within days. And if you are, a regular tour is 3 years, so the people at the embassy here are on 3-year tours. Is that enough? I'm asked all the time, including this morning at another event, why is it so only 3 years? Because it probably takes a year to get used to the new country, new position. Because remember, if you're an economic officer, doesn't mean you've got to be doing economic work every single post. You might go from economic to public diplomacy to consular to to anything else. And then you also have to think about your next assignment. And you start bidding a year ahead, right? Now they're bidding for next summer. You also have to think about evaluations, promotions. So in essence, most people probably have a year of those 3 years that they can really focus on the work. Is that effective? But anyway, so I'll leave you with this and happy to answer any questions, but please don't ask me about the CIA. Because every time, especially overseas, did you write about